tension, I think, today is not between men and women so much as within men's own head between these two competing scripts. There's a sociologist, he would ask young men, what does it mean to be a good man? Everyone around the world said, well, integrity, honesty, sacrifice. And then when he'd say, but what does it mean to be a real man? They would say, be tough, be strong, get rich, get laid, which is what people mean when they say toxic.
Yeah.
So I've spent 33 seasons in an NFL locker room. I've never mentioned that on Family Life before, have I?
I don't think you have.
But I was the Detroit Lions chaplain. I was around a lot of men, young men. And then I coached high school football for 13, I think, seasons. So I'm around a lot of high school men.
And you've coached a lot of teams over the years of guys. We had 3 boys, so you coached a lot of their teams as well.
Yeah, and then pastoring, a church with thousands of men. One of the questions I would often ask either a high school boy or an NFL player or just a guy in our church, tell me what a real man is. Tell me what a godly man is. What is a man? I am not kidding. I don't think I ever got a clear answer. It was confusion. It was, well, maybe there was never really any clarity. It was just, well, maybe it's, and then I look at especially high school boys and say, when do you become a man? Had no idea. Like when you get your driver's license, nobody knew. And so
do you feel like you had a good answer for that?
I didn't when I was growing up.
Yeah.
As I became a husband, I went on a journey basically to Scripture to say, what does God say a man is and a woman? And yeah, I think I had a clear answer. But I don't think our culture, and even in the church, I don't think we know.
I think we're living in different days, even than when you were coaching. And
what's that mean?
I think that there's just a lot of different views now of what people would say a real man, and especially a man of God is. And it's not always looked at in a positive way. Yeah. And so today it's going to be really fun and interesting.
Yeah, we have a woman in the studio that's going to talk to us about masculinity. We have Nancy Pearcey back on Family Life today. I don't know how many years it's been since you've been in here, but we are glad to have you back. Do you know how many years?
I think about 4 years.
Oh, it's been that.
Well, Love Thy Body. It was for my earlier book, Love Thy Body, and that came out in 2018.
Had to be right before we...
Yeah, it was before we were here. Maybe we were here.
No.
All right, we're going to edit that part, but anyway.
Yeah, and this book has just come out, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Okay, Nancy, having lunch with you was one of the most invigorating lunches.
It was.
As you talked about this topic, I would love to be a student in your class. You teach at Houston Baptist, and you have young men and women, college kids in there every day. And I'm just sitting there thinking, I would love to sit under your teaching.
Our listeners, this is a treat. She's really wise, really thoughtful. And you've talked to a lot of people. You've read a lot. You've studied the scriptures a lot. And so I'm kind of excited that we get to talk about this topic because I think there is a lot of confusion. Nancy, do you think there is?
Oh, yes. And let me step in first and say our university is changing its name.
Oh, really?
So
has it changed yet?
Houston Christian. It takes a long time, but it's going from Houston Baptist to Houston Christian. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
How long have you been teaching?
10 years.
Oh,
10 years at Houston Christian.
I'm guessing students line up for your class.
I would.
That's my guess. Am I right?
Well, I got nominated for the teaching award this year.
There it is.
So there you go.
How many books have you written?
You would ask a hard question.
I would, of course. You've written a lot of books.
There's so many you can't count?
It's 6 or 7. I don't know exactly. And some of them were smaller, some were bigger. But so I was here last for Love Thy Body.
Yep.
And my best-selling book still, though, is Total Truth. Mm-hmm. And then Finding Truth was sort of a follow-up to that. Saving Leonardo was sort of my Francis Schaeffer book because he was known for looking at how ideas percolate down through the arts. Mm. And so Saving Leonardo is on how ideas are communicating through art, literature, music, and so on. So that's one of my funnest books. You'll appreciate that. We were having a music talk right before we went on the air.
Oh, when you said that, I'm like, I got to read that. I mean, I love art
Nancy's
and
a violinist.
Theology and art. And anyway,
exactly.
That's a whole other discussion.
Yes, and I do. I play the violin. And so before that, my first book was on science, on the relationship of Christianity and science, called The Soul of Science.
Which makes sense. You teach apologetics.
Yes, I teach apologetics. That's
Now,
what I
let me ask you this, because I don't know a lot of this backstory. What's the former agnostic?
Oh, so my personal story, which I do love to tell, by the way. I've started using it now in all of my speaking because I realize the older I get, the more thankful I am that God got hold of me. And so I've been using my story a lot more. I was raised in a Christian home, but mine was Scandinavian. All Scandinavians are Lutheran because it was a state church. And it's kind of like all Irish are Catholic or all Italians are Catholic. In other words, they rely a lot on the ethnicity to hold you. There's not a lot of strong personal commitment. And so when I was in high school, I started asking questions.
Because you're a thinker.
And I'm going to a public school,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And all my textbooks are secular, all my teachers are secular. And I just started asking, how do we know it's true? That was it. How do we know Christianity is true? And nobody in my life could answer that. None of the adults in my life could answer that. I talked to a Christian college professor and I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? And he said, works for me. That's it. And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and I thought I would get a more substantial answer from him.
So you're really looking for answers.
I was asking a lot of questions. Yeah, I didn't just slide. A lot of people sort of slide away from their Christian background. Yeah. And no, when I gave up my Christian faith, it was, I immediately realized that if there was no God, there's no meaning to life. There's no foundation for ethics. This is true for me, true for you. There's no purpose for life. We're just on a rock flying through empty space. I realize there's not even a foundation for knowledge in the sense that if all I've had is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space, what makes me think I could have some kind of universal, absolute truth? Ridiculous. I mean, at 16, it struck me that was ridiculous. So I became a relativist and a skeptic and a determinist. I absorbed all of these secular isms. And so by the time I was in college, I went back to Europe. We had lived in Europe when I was a child, and I'd really loved it. So I saved my money all through high school from playing in the local symphony, by the way. That was my job.
Yeah. Playing the violin.
Playing the violin. So that I could go back to Europe. And when I was in Europe the second time, that's when I sort of stumbled across L'Abri, the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, which is an apologetics ministry.
Right,
That's what he was known for. And his form of apologetics is the term cultural apologetics was coined to describe what he did, because he didn't just deal with abstract arguments, in the logical ether. He looked at ideas as they percolate down through a culture, through art, literature, music, and so on. And so
that's right up your alley.
That spoke to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would not have been drawn in by any other form of apologetics.
Wow.
So that spoke to me, and I at first I left.
Did you?
I was at L'Abri twice because the first time it was so attractive. I'd never seen such an attractive form of Christianity. Not only was it intellectually engaging, but culturally, the arts. And on top of all that, this was 1971, and everyone there was hippies. But that was a serious consideration in the sense that at that time, nobody was reaching across that cultural divide and reaching out to these disaffected young people. So I thought, who are these Christians? They can even talk to hippies.
Wow.
So, but because it was so appealing, I was afraid I might be drawn in emotionally, and I didn't.
And you didn't want that.
I didn't want to do that because Christianity let me down once already. So I wasn't going to go back lightly. So I stayed a month and studied, left L'Abri, went home, but because of L'Abri, I discovered there was such a thing as apologetics. So I discovered C.S. Lewis, not only Schaeffer, but Lewis, Chesterton, and so on. And so just through my own reading, I eventually decided, okay, I am intellectually convinced it's true. Now where do I find Christians? Because I wasn't in a church or anything. I said, well, I knew some back at L'Abri. So a year and a half later, I went back to L'Abri, and that's where I really got grounded in understanding Christian worldview and on apologetics and so on. So it's shaped all my writing since then. Everything I do is like I want to help young people who were having the same questions that I had when I was that age.
What a
Wow.
great story. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the toxic war on masculinity. And you begin it with a story of your dad. So I'm guessing this has a foundation of why you want to study this, because it's full. I can't wait to get into the content, but tell us about your dad, I guess.
Yeah. So I haven't given this story publicly very often yet.
Are you afraid?
But my father was physically abusive, severely physically abusive.
He's no longer living.
No, I would never tell the story until
Yeah.
after he died.
Yeah. But severely, you're saying.
Yeah, so, for example, he wouldn't say, do this or I'll spank you. He'd say, do this or I'll beat you.
Oh.
And then he would, fists. If you read books on abuse, they'll sometimes say open hand or closed fist. Well, it was closed fist.
Yeah.
And his favorite was the knuckle fist. That's where you put your middle finger out slightly so it's a sharper stab of pain. So, yeah, it was very severe. And so,
Did you have any siblings?
yes, there's 6 kids in the family.
Oh. And where did you fall in line?
So I was third,
And this was going on with all your siblings?
all except the last one. I used to work for Prison Fellowship.
Wow, yeah.
And one thing we knew was even violent people mellow over time. Even violent criminals mellow over time. So my dad did mellow by the 6th kid. The 6th kid is the only one who doesn't have a memory of being beaten. But the rest of us do, yeah.
What about your mom?
No.
He
No.
never touched her.
No. Not that he was pretty verbally abusive to her. He didn't respect her at all. And we didn't either. I mean, we took our cues from him, right? You do. He treats her like, a dish rag, so we did as well. And then she never stood up for us. This is our complaint with our mom, right? That she never stood up for us. But looking back as an adult, I don't blame her. I wouldn't stand up to that guy either.
He was probably scary. He was probably a scary dad.
It was very scary.
Yeah.
Fear. I mean, when I became a Christian, and started going through all the emotional healing of this, let me give you the emotional healing side.
Yeah.
So in my book, Toxic War on Masculinity, I do talk about when the healing started, because I had one person say, I opened your book and I read your story and I thought, oh no, this is going to be some angry feminist. And then I got to the end and I realized, oh no, it's a story of healing. At L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker who agreed to be on staff because she realized that a lot of people's problems with Christianity were not just intellectual.
Right.
So the apologetics wasn't the only thing, but it also is often emotional, especially, conflict with your parents and so on. And her name was Sheila Bird, when we called her Birdie. And the interesting thing is, she saw my dad. So the reason I ended up at L'Abri was because my father was trying to keep this short, but my father was teaching in Turkey at the Middle East Technical University.
So he was a teacher too.
So he was a professor, a university professor. And it was right before the military coup, and there was a lot of violence happening, especially against Westerners, car bombings and package bombings. And so they told my dad, you need to get out. It's too dangerous. So he's driving across Europe to catch the cheap Luxembourg flights. They were special flights back then. And a Christian friend told him, if you're driving through Switzerland, you've got to stop at this place called L'Abri. And so he writes to me I was in Germany, and he writes to me and says, come on down and see us. Well, people will sometimes ask me, why would you go to a Christian ministry if you were not a Christian? I said, well, I didn't go to a Christian ministry. I went to see my parents because I wasn't going to see them again. They were going back to the States. So I went to L'Abri to see my parents, not to go to a Christian ministry.
Interesting. Let me ask you, at that time, what were your thoughts about your dad, your father?
Oh, I had totally suppressed it. This was interesting. I had so suppressed it because I thought my childhood was so unhappy that I'm going to start my life over.
So you just buried it.
I totally buried it. I thought, I'm going to recreate myself from scratch. I thought you could do that. And so this is why it was so important that God let me be at a place where there was a psychiatric social worker. And not only that, but so at L'Abri, Francis Schaeffer used to have Saturday night discussions. So my family, my parents and a couple siblings were there. And Birdie saw my father. And she told me when I went to see her, she said, I looked at your father and I thought, here is a man who suppresses everyone around him.
Wow.
She could see it. And in hindsight, I might not have even talked about it. I had suppressed it so carefully that she knew to ask.
She knew to ask.
She knew to ask about my family, about my father. She also noticed, by the way, that our family was totally disconnected. There was no coherence. There were no emotional bonds, among anyone in our family.
Were you surprised when she said that to you?
Well, not entirely, because if you looked at my dad, I would agree with her.
So it was obvious.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it was. He had these steely blue eyes that looked like,
Yeah.
Yes. He had that look, definitely.
Well, what did the healing look like?
So Birdie, first of all, she had to persuade me, you cannot just walk away from your past. You do have to work through this stuff with your father. And my sister, by the way, who was also not a Christian, also stayed with me at L'Abri at that time. My older sister, she had not suppressed it. She was a little older. We sat on the side of the Alps, because L'Abri is in the Swiss Alps.
Wow. Yeah.
We sat on the side of the Swiss Alps mountainside, and she would say, do you remember when Dad used to do this? Do you remember when Dad used to do that? And I'm like, oh, of course I do. But I had so suppressed it that I wasn't consciously thinking of it anymore. But of course I do.
Yeah.
So that was helpful too. Between my sister and Birdie, we went back through my past, and basically it's the healing power is love. Experiencing love from Birdie that I'd never experienced before. Being able to talk openly about these things where I expected to be rejected. Right? You don't talk about people about your deepest pain. You don't expect people to keep loving and accepting you on that level, but she did. So that was it. When I left L'Abri, my model of God was Birdie.
Wow.
I knew what love was because I'd experienced it with Birdie. And when I prayed, it was almost like I had an image of somebody like Birdie. And she would ask her gentle, probing questions. And so I would hear God, asking these gentle, probing questions, getting deeper and deeper. And so the emotional healing really started at L'Abri, and learning to experience God's love, because God's love is the ultimate healing power, to have such a transformative relationship with God, that God's love actually changes you.
That's so beautiful. And I'm wondering, so often they'll say your view of God is many times tainted by your view of your father.
Good or bad?
Right. And did you have that experience?
Oh, yeah. But Birdie solved that in a lot of ways. Having one person step in and be different.
That's so encouraging.
True. Yeah, it made a big difference.
Now, as you think back on that, and in regards to what you're writing now about masculinity, was your view of masculinity defined by your dad?
Well, so as you can imagine, I came a raving feminist.
Because of your dad, you think?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Do you think he was toxic? I put quotations around that word.
Well, his behavior in the home was definitely toxic.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't be beating kids.
Yeah, and not be, something's wrong.
Something's deeply wrong if you can beat children.
Yes.
Then he'd fall on the ground and he'd kick you, and it was
So
like I said,
sad.
She's tearing up. I know, I am too. So I did become very much of a feminist.
Really?
I was always reading some feminist book. I read all the major, groundbreaking feminists, from Betty Friedan, to Simone de Beauvoir and Kate Millett. I read them all, and I think it's because whenever they talked about how horrible men were, I thought,
Yeah.
You agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. So it affected my view of men, even though the healing in my relationship with God was very real.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that. I want to make sure you got that part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But my view of men was very tainted, definitely. And I thought every feminist book I read, I thought was better than the last one.
Really?
I always had a feminist book on my bedside. Always. So that's where it came. That's where it really came out. Is I really had to think through it. When I finally stopped using the word feminist to describe myself is when NOW, the National Organization for Women, became pretty much focused just on abortion and lesbianism. They really did. And I thought, well, if I use the word feminist now, I'm going to be misunderstood. People will think I'm in favor of abortion and lesbianism. So the word has been tainted. First, I became a pro-life feminist. Do you know that group?
No, I didn't know that.
There's a group called pro-life feminism. So I thought, okay, I'll go with them.
Let me ask you. Have you been married 50 years?
Almost.
Yeah. And so how did that affect your marriage? Did you view your husband in a negative kind of way?
You would think it would, but I don't think so, because I don't think it did, because can I do the Myers-Briggs thing here?
Yeah.
Because I'm an INFP. I mean, I'm a very strong F. And so
Feeler.
my
introverted,
feeler,
intuitive feeler.
I'm very
perceiver,
relational.
Yeah.
I'm very relational.
Yeah.
So I have very deep personal relationships.
Which was helpful for your marriage. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I use the Myers-Briggs in the classroom all the time. I don't let a student get out of my classroom without knowing what their type is.
It's interesting, as you talk about your background, as I read through The Toxic War of Masculinity, and again, I mean, there's so much in there. I don't even know where to start. There's so many things that you walk through, even the history of masculinity in our culture. I put the book down thinking you are very pro-man, very pro-masculinity.
Yes.
And hearing that background, I'm like, wow, this has been quite a journey.
A transformation.
You end up at the end of the book going, men are good. You know what I mean? It's not a book ripping on men. Here's the journey of men have gone through, and here's what really masculinity looks like.
In a beautiful way.
As a man, I'm like, yeah, I want to hand this to everybody and say, this is a godly perspective on manhood, but the journey that you went on is very interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm glad that's what comes through, because I certainly did try to make it positive toward men. Even when I dealt with some of the difficulties that men have in our culture, and even when I dealt at the end, I dealt with abusive marriages and so on, and I tried to always keep that positive. So I'm glad that's what's coming through, because, men don't respond well to being accused of being toxic. And who would, right? So, and in fact, I start the book, here's what I found really effective. There's a sociologist who did a study, and he ends up saying, in our culture, there's two competing scripts for manhood. He's a very well-known sociologist, so he speaks around the world, in countries around the world. And so he began to use that as his testing ground, and he would ask young men, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral, in the eulogy, somebody says, he was a good man. What does that mean? And they had no trouble answering that. Everyone around the world said, well, integrity, honesty, sacrifice, help out the little guy. I kind of like that one. Help out the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be generous, and so on.
This is worldwide.
Worldwide. From Australia to Ecuador to India. It's fascinating. But then he would have a follow-up question. He said, okay, what does it mean if I say, man up, be a real man? And actually, I want to read that one, because I want you to know these are not my words.
Yeah.
So this is in my notes. And they would say, oh, no, a real man, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid.
Who said that?
The young men would say that. If you said, what does it mean to be a good man?
Yeah, man up.
They would know.
Yeah.
And by the way, he would say, where did you learn that? Integrity, sacrifice.
Yeah.
And they would say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. And if in the Western countries, they would say, it's our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Oh.
And then when he'd say, but what does it mean to be a real man? Then they would say, no. That means be tough, be strong, get rich, get laid. And so the real tension, I think, today is not between men and women so much as within men's own head, between these two competing scripts. And so as our culture has become more secular, the good man ideal is fading, is losing its hold on men's hearts. And what's left is more the real man, which which is what people mean when they say toxic.
Yes.
They mean the real man, entitlement, power over, dominance, and so on.
Is that why you wanted to write about it and study it?
No, that was not what. That was one of the sociologists who I read when I was involved in it. That's not what I first got started. No, when I first got started, I will tell you. Well, there's two reasons. One is I did have to ask, where is this coming from? Because the hostility against men is so extreme today. Even in mainstream publications, I read a Washington Post article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Like, what? This is not some fringe feminist publication. It's the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Why can't we hate men? Or there's a trendy hashtag now, "Kill all men." Like, what?
Is it just the United States, or is it happening worldwide of this negative opinion of men?
Well, I think it's worldwide, just because whatever happens in the United States spreads. Our culture tends to spread. But I was so blown away by how hostile the rhetoric is today, how acceptable it is to say things negatively. There are books out now with titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" I mean, you can get published with titles like that.
And even on TV, you see the man is the dummy. They're always dumbing him down, or he's the joke of the program. And it never used to be like that. I don't know if it was healthy in the past, but now we're at a whole different place.
And even men. This was part of the surprise for me was I looked at, you probably saw it. There was a news article where James Cameron, the director of Avatar, said testosterone is a toxin.
Yeah.
And you have to work it out of your system. Or there's a best-selling science fiction writer, Hugh Howey, who said, testosterone is the problem. Women should be in charge of everything. Another book author said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And so then these are men. These are even male writers.
And you're reading these things and getting a little riled up about it.
Yeah, I'm thinking, well, where does this come from?
That's my question.
Yeah.
Where does it come from?
Let me start where I start in the book. Is I wanted to start with the good news because the bad news is pretty depressing. So I told you that I did a lot of reading groups on this manuscript, and I used to have the good news at the end because logically you give the problem, then the solution. People got too depressed. So I moved the good news to the front. So here's the good news. Okay, so the good news is that evangelical men are doing very well. Christian men are, in fact, doing very well. And most Christians don't even know this. In fact, the reason they don't know it is because there's a lot of criticism of them as well. So let me give you a few quotes on that. It's very easy to find these online. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Another quote, it's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. Another quote, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. The problem with these accusations is that they ignore the data from the social sciences. And this is what I will start the book with now. The studies have found that evangelical family men, meaning husbands and fathers, who attend church regularly are the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. So compared to the average American family man, evangelical men are the most loving to their wives. And yes, they do interview the wives separately. That's important because women wouldn't necessarily be honest.
Right.
And the women report the highest levels of being happy with the way their husbands treat them, with feeling loved and appreciated. They are the most engaged with their children, both in shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in discipline like setting screen time or setting bedtime. They are the least likely to divorce of any group in America. And here's the real stunner. They have the lowest rates of domestic violence of any major group in America.
Wow.
I tell people this, and everyone always sits back kind of like, what?
Yeah.
How come we don't know this? The reason you don't know this is it's all buried in the academic literature. I had to read mostly academic sociological journals to pull this out. Because
But it was there.
It was there. Sociologists have been doing these studies, partly because they wanted to find out what is the data. They read these accusations and they say, yeah, but where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? So they go back and they do the studies, and they found that evangelical men actually are the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers of any group in America. And we don't know that. In fact, don't we hear that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of society?
Mm-hmm. And that's not true, and it's never been true.
But it is, what I found out in my research, it's one of the most widely cited statistics
Really?
by Christian leaders.
Yeah.
Like they're trying to, motivate us with negatives. But what happened is the sociologists went back to the data then, and they divided out truly committed Christian men who do attend church regularly.
We're calling those the evangelicals. Is that what we're saying?
There are people who identify. Hold on.
Yeah. Okay.
Not
Go
quite.
Ahead. Yeah.
Because you can identify. The divide was a church attending. It turns out you don't even have to delve very deeply into their ideas. Just ask if they attend church regularly. It turns out that's a fairly reliable correlate of whether they are truly committed Christians, authentic Christians, versus nominal. That's the dividing line. Versus nominal. I have to tell my students they don't know that word. Nominal means in name only, because NOM is Latin for name, so nominal. Nominal Christians are men who might identify as evangelical. They might use that label.
But they're not going to church, like you even said in the book, 3 times a month. They're going less, maybe once, maybe not. Right?
Rarely,
Nominal.
if at all. Right. So on one of these surveys, they might check the Baptist box.
Okay.
Which they identify as an evangelical denomination. But they actually do not attend church regularly. It's mostly a family background. It's a cultural background. And the differences between these groups are absolutely devastating.
I mean, am I right in what I read, you saying that the difference is if you're a practicing evangelical man, all the things you just said are true. If you're nominal, you're worse than a secular man.
Yeah,
That's what I
was
concluded.
shocking.
That was scary.
It was shocking when I first read it. Yes. On all those numbers, first, their wives are the least happy with how their husbands treat them. They're the least engaged with their children in terms of shared activities and discipline. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men, and they have the highest level of domestic violence of any group in America. Jeez. You are right, higher than secular men. So this is amazing. And this is what the church is up against then, because they are claiming to be Christian. I only found one study that gave the sizes. I thought you and I probably hang out mostly with very committed Christian men, so we think, those nominals, that's probably a small group, right? No, they're about the same size. Mm-hmm. In America, where there's so much cultural Christianity, they're about the same size. That means if you meet somebody who claims to be a Christian, or even an evangelical, there's about a 50% chance that it's actually a nominal Christian who tests out worse than secular men. This is really what young women need to know this when they're dating.
Seriously.
They are about the same size in terms of sheer numbers.
So you're saying a single girl that's dating a guy, she should say, hey, how many times did you go to church this month? And he says once, you say, see you later?
I'd say
you're going to be worse to me than that guy over there that says he doesn't believe in God. That is a little scary.
I'm thinking they need to identify them by their fruit.
Yes.
As Jesus, you're looking for the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, because they may be saying that they're a Christian, but by the fruit, it doesn't look like they are.
And it also tells you what the church is up against. In other words, people who are claiming to be Christian, because they hang around the fringes of the church. Some people ask me, well, why are they worse than secular men?
I wonder that.
Yes, okay, good. It seems to be, sociologists are number crunchers, so they don't always tell you why. But apparently, they hang around the Christian world enough to get the language of headship and submission.
Oh.
And then they insert secular meaning of dominance, control, entitlement, and so on. But they've picked up the language that makes them feel more justified in those kind of attitudes. And so they end up actually being worse than secular men. Because some secular men, there was an article. I wanted to read you this one quote. My go-to sociologist here, the one who did the largest study, his name is Brad Wilcox, and he is at the University of Virginia. And he's considered like one of the top marriage researchers in the nation. And so he gets quoted in places like the New York Times. So he was quoted in the New York Times saying, they had for Valentine's Day, the New York Times had published an article saying that progressive marriages are the happiest marriages because they are at least trying to be more egalitarian. At any rate, so Brad Wilcox writes a response, and he says, you're right. Progressive marriages are actually better than the run-of-the-mill marriage because they are more intentional about their relationship. And then he says, but let me show you my evangelicals.
Oh, wow.
It's a J curve. The evangelical goes way up. And let me read you the numbers. He says, it turns out that the happiest wives in all America. By the way, they emphasize the wives because the assumption is that if there's any notion of a headship of authority, that it's going to be oppressive to the woman.
Right.
Abusive to the woman. So they usually phrase it in terms of the wives. It turns out that the happiest wives of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. So this is amazing. I can't believe the New York Times printed this.
Me neither.
What was the response? Did people push back on that?
We'll have to go online and read the the reader responses.
Yeah.
I just pulled out the quote because even Christians don't know this. We don't have the confidence that that we are doing so well compared to the rest of the culture. And so that was when you asked me in the earlier section, what was your ultimate motivation for writing? It was when I read these statistics that I said, we need to get these statistics out there. Brad Wilcox is not the only one. I have about a dozen different sociologists and psychologists that I quote in my book. But nobody knows about it.
And you're saying this is hopeful. This is hopeful news. Then it's good news when you're talking about and hearing about so much toxic masculinity. There's good news in the midst.
Isn't it? It's so encouraging. And, again, how do we get men to behave better? Tell them where they're doing a good job. Tell them where they're doing great stuff.
There's your book. That's the book she's writing next, is how a woman can influence a man in the positive. But think about this, because I was one of those pastors that didn't know the data on divorce in the church. I had heard what we all heard, and I had said from the stage, I'm sure I said it more than a few times, hey, the divorce rate in the world is 50%. The divorce rate in the church is the same. It's 50%. It was always not true. Shanta Feldhahn, in her book of Happy Marriages, said, no, the actual divorce rate in the church of practicing church-going couples is less than 25%. So I think it's 23% a few years back. But here's the thing. If you're sitting in church and your pastor up there says, divorce rate here is the same as there, that is not hopeful. You think, okay, we might as well get divorced. We're not working out. I'm in church. The couple sitting beside me is getting divorced just like anybody that doesn't believe in God. But if you hear what you just said, men are better, wives are happier, they're more emotionally engaged, the violence in the home is so less.
It's
when
so
you
hopeful.
are regularly practicing your faith, this is one of the results. That inspires people to say, I am going to get serious about my faith. That's good news.
Exactly. Most of the numbers put these two groups together. If engage, well, I like your word, practicing. That's a good word. If practicing evangelical men do better than secular men, but nominal Christian men do worse than secular men, if you put these two groups together, which is what most surveys do. Right? Most surveys just, are you an evangelical? Okay, we'll put you in this box. Obviously, the numbers are going to be completely skewed. Yeah. So that's where most of our statistics get it wrong, because they put these two groups together.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about how the script turned to toxic. This revolution of...
You really want to go toxic?
I'm
kidding.
I do.
I'm kidding. I love this good news. I just want to live here.
I thought it was really interesting of just how this played out over our history. And you laid that out. So take us back in time.
Yeah, like I said, I really wanted to understand where this is coming from, because you can't really effectively counter something if you don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And how it developed. So it turns out that that very concept that masculinity is toxic has much deeper roots than most of us realize. Most of us probably think, the 60s or something with the feminist movement, second wave. No. You have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the colonial age, right? Men and women worked side by side. Husband and wife worked side by side.
Farming.
On the family farm, the family industry, the family shop. And so the husband and wife have a partnership day in and day out. Plus, men are working with their children all day. They're the ones who are teaching them, training them, and teaching them adult skills. And so men were expected, fathers were expected to be just as involved with their children as mothers were. And so the social expectation at the time was much more that men were in the caretaking role. They were supposed to be not only fathers of their families, but a very common phrase back then was fathers of the community. They were supposed to bring that caretaking role into their community
in a very loving way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. One of my historians that I quote, not Christian, said that in the colonial age, the masculine role was defined in terms of duty to God and man, is how you put it. That was a phrase back then. That you were to look out for the common good. That was another very prevalent in the colonial age. The concept of authority was not, hey, I'm in charge, I get to do what I want.
So it wasn't domineering.
The concept of authority was very clear. I mean, this is in the literature of the time. It means you're responsible for the common good. In other words, I look out for my good, you look out for what's good for you, but who looks out for the common good of our marriage, of our family? That's what authority was for, to look out for the common good.
When I read that, I was like, man, that man is so different than the man today. Even the fact that cooking books were written for men. They were very comfortable in the kitchen. I'm not saying that's not true today, but it was like that was what a man's role was in a home. He was a nurturer of his family, of his kids. And we live in a culture now, it's like that's a woman's job, not a man's job. And that was never true.
I know. I love reading some of the historians. That was one of the quotes in the book, is that men were as comfortable in the kitchen as women were. Yeah. Was a direct quote from one of the historians. Exactly. So the colonial era, and of course it was mostly Christian back then. I'm happy that I was able to start with early America, because that gives you kind of a Christian concept of masculinity too. When I talk about the Puritans with my students, they say, I never heard anything good about the Puritans before.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And I have some beautiful quotes on their marriages. Their marriages were incredibly affectionate. Their respect for their wives permeates all these quotes from the Puritans at the time. So the view of marriage and the view of masculinity in the colonial era was extremely positive. And so it gives us a baseline that we can compare to.
And then came the Industrial Revolution.
And work is taken out of the home. And that seems like a fairly simple thing. But what happens is, of course, men have to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they're not working with people that they love and have a moral bond with. They're working as an individual man in competition with other men. And that's where you see the script start to change. And it was protest at first, by the way. People protested that our men are changing. In the industrial in the industrial workplace, it seemed like men had to, be much more self-assertive, aggressive, look out for number one, egocentric, make it financially. And this is the language at the time was our men are losing the Christian ethos that they used to have. And so the language becomes more negative, but not in condemnation, but in protest. We're protesting that men are becoming more secular. Oh, and it's more secular. That was part of it too. So this as the public square becomes large, with factories and offices and banks, academia, and so on. These large public institutions grow up. People began to say, well, they should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value free. We need to keep. We need to keep your personal morality out of the public realm, which is what we hear today.
Yeah.
But that's when it started. Don't bring your personal values into the public square. Keep those at home. So men were being socialized into a secular worldview through their education and the workplace much sooner than women were.
And what was happening with the women in that time?
Right. So somebody had to stay home with kids. Right. But if values don't belong in the public square, well, people still wanted to, though they still wanted to maintain values like love and altruism and self-sacrifice and religious devotion and so on. So who's going to be in charge of them? Well, if they're at home, women are in charge of them. So for the first time ever in human history, women start being held up as morally superior to men. All the way back to the ancient Greeks, virtue, the insight between right and wrong was seen as a rational insight. And men were thought to be more rational, and therefore men are more moral. Men are morally stronger than women. And in fact, the word virtue, do you know what its root is? V-I-R is Latin for man. Like the word virile.
Oh.
So virtue had overtones of masculine strength and honor.
Huh.
So men were thought to be more virtuous. In the 19th century, for the first time ever, you see culture shifting and saying women are more virtuous. Women are more spiritually stronger, more morally, Men are out in that rough and tumble, amoral, secular realm of the marketplace and commerce and politics. And at night they come home and be reformed and refined by their morally superior wives. That's where you get the double standard. I mean, we still have to some degree the double standard. We still tend to think, what was Me Too all about? Women are more virtuous and we can call these men to account. So we still have that double standard, and this is when it began.
I'm thinking about the attendance in a church, and I don't know if this is true. I'd have to research it, but most churches I go into, generally speaking, have more women than men. And I'm wondering...
Still true, statistically.
That's what I'm saying, but I'm wondering back before the industrial age, if you would have gone into a church, would it have been more even?
It has different historians have different opinions on this. So I couldn't quite get a clear count. Today, the average church has 60% women, 40% men.
Okay.
That's David Moreau's statistic. Yeah. We talked about David Moreau earlier. Church for Men. But in the early church too, there's a historian. He's a sociologist, but he studies the history of religion. His name is Rodney Stark. He has a book on his book. It's a great book. He says from the beginning, women were more drawn to the Christian church because they were given such higher status in the church than they were in the surrounding Roman culture. Women had very, very low status in the culture. Men had no obligation to be faithful to their wives, for example. It was totally accepted that men would have sex with anyone and everyone, with prostitutes and mistresses and most of all slaves, both men and women, both male and female slaves, for example. And so there's a quote from a Roman poet, for example, who even chastises women for complaining when their husbands had sex with male slaves. He says, you know that sex with men is more satisfying. That was a common view. So when they went into the Christian church, they had much higher status and much more honor. And so he says all the way from the beginning, we see evidence that there were more women than men because women were so much more honored and respected in the Christian church. I forget, there was one of the church fathers who complains that we have so many Christian maidens. That's his, his ancient word. Yeah. We have so many Christian maidens that we're having trouble finding husbands for all of them.
Wow. And
that's why 1 Peter talks about what do you do if your husband's not a Christian? That was so common.
Yeah.
At any rate, so it appears that Christianity, to some degree, has always attracted more women than men. But it did grow worse in America, especially after the First and Second Great Awakenings. The Great Awakenings, in many ways are what framed, gave us evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And they did a great deal of good work. A lot of people, came to Christianity or were restored to their faith through the Great Awakenings. But the problem with them was that they had some negative baggage. They tended to focus on an intense emotional conversion experience. And who were thought to be more emotional? Women. Were. So that did seem to put religion into the sphere of women.
Interesting.
So, yes, if you look at engravings made at the time of some of the revivals, they almost always show more women than men. And the women would often be in the center swooning and falling over and having these great emotional experiences.
Interesting.
So, so evangelicalism has had a greater problem even than historic Christianity in terms of attracting more women.
When I read through your chapter on the Industrial Revolution, and obviously there was a lot of good things, industry. I mean, we're not just saying it was a bad thing. It was just the net result on men and the family. One of your quotes that was a letter to the editor in The Independent. I'm just going to read it. It said, "The American man," this is during this Industrial Revolution time, "the American man in gaining the world is losing his own soul. He prostitutes his energy, vigor, and courage to one sole end, materialistic success. Mammonology, the idolatry of mammon or money, is the great American religion." And, as I read that, I thought, even today,
yes.
And I want to say to the men listening, we are still prone, it's centuries later, but we are prone, and I'm not saying women aren't as well.
I think we are too in this day, Dave.
We are prone to mammonology.
Yeah,
I've never even heard that term before. I'm like, we worship money, success. I'm not blaming the Industrial Revolution, but it brought that in higher, success rates, money, prosperity, you name it, all beautiful things. But the American church is plagued by that as well. And I just want to say to a man, that is not our call. Our call is to serve our wife. Our call is to serve our children. Our call is to be the leader of the community like it was in the colonial age. I mean, not that that was utopia, but we've lost a lot of that. And I think we are easy as men today. And it becomes toxic is because we become obsessed with the wrong things, and that hurts our women, it hurts our families, it hurts our kids,
our society.
And part of me, when I read your book, and it revitalized my own soul to say that's what a man's called to, not idolatry, but a worship of God. And when I, as a man and as a husband and as a dad, lived that out and surrender to Jesus, the women and children in my home and in our culture thrive. Am I right? I mean, it brings life to everyone around you.
I'm clapping my hands because I think we as women, we are longing for that. We're longing for men to step into, and we as women are called to step into our identity as women of who God has made us. But culturally speaking, I look at you and I think we need men to step into that loving, sacrificial, protecting in a beautiful way and serving their families, their wives, and their community. We need it as a culture and a community.
Yeah, and part of me wants to say, guys, just live as Jesus lived. You want an image? There it is. And I'll remind you, you can't. You can't apart from Christ. If he isn't giving you the power to do that, you'll never do it. But if you do, trust me, your marriage, your home, your city, your neighborhood, your church will thrive.
Thank you, Nancy, for all you're doing.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for watching. And if you like this episode,
you better like it.
Just hit that like button.
And we'd like you to subscribe. So all you got to do is go down and hit the subscribe. I can't say the word subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. I don't think I can say this word.
Like and subscribe.
Look at that. You say it so easy. Subscribe. There it goes.